Okay, good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today. Nice to virtually see all of you, and appreciate the time you're taking to hear more about MCAS and MCAS-Alt for students with disabilities. We have a pretty packed presentation today in about an hour and a half in which to give you all this information. So I'll just get started by saying that I'm Dan Weiner. I'm the Administrator of Inclusive Assessment in the Student Assessment Services Unit at the department. And I'm joined by Robert Pelliciotti, who works on my team there, and he is the Accommodations and Competency Portfolio Coordinator. And he'll tell you more about both of those topics in the course of this presentation. We also have Deborah Hand working in the background answering questions, particularly about MCAS-Alt. So Kev, let's see what we do about questions today and how that works. You're all muted so that you won't distract me with your discussions and your questions, but you can type your questions into the Q&A below. If you just hover your cursor over the bottom part of the screen, you'll see a Q&A box. You type your question. We'll try to respond in writing as we can, as time permits and as we know the answers. But if your question is off topic or about a specific student, we're probably going to wait and answer that at the end. We'll do two things. We're going to ask you to contact us directly at the email address at the bottom of your screen, or we're going to prepare a Q&A and a table, an Excel file with questions and answers that were asked during this session, and we're going to send that to you probably in about 4 days to a week, and we'll get you all of the questions and all of the answers. But if you ask a question, please be aware that the answer will probably be coming up in the presentation. So a good approach here might be to wait for the presentation, and when you hear a topic on which you have a question afterward, then jot your question down in the Q&A, because otherwise, again, as I said, the topic will probably be presented and you'll get the answer without having to ask the question and be distracted while you were doing that. So thanks for your cooperation as we get through this. Our topics today include an overview of MCAS. We're going to talk about what happened last year, including the results, talk about this coming year, and we'll discuss graduation requirements. I'm going to turn it over then to Rob Pelliciotti, who is going to talk with you about accessibility and accommodations and who gets what, who's eligible to receive which accommodations and accessibility tools and so forth. That'll be a quick gallop through the Accessibility and Accommodations Manual, which is posted online on the MCAS site and has all of the details that you're likely to want to know about as you proceed through the fall and into the winter. Then we'll discuss the MCAS alternate assessment, known as the MCAS-Alt. Quick overview about what the requirements are, how they performed last year. Last year was a kind of a funny year, a truncated year with an extended deadline and late scoring, sort of kind of late reporting, but we tried to make up some lost time. We're going to talk about who should be taking the MCAS-Alt, more on that 1% cap, and how we find the students who might be better suited to take standard tests with accommodations. Rob will be back then to talk about grade level and competency portfolios, which is a third alternative to the MCAS-Alt, the test with accommodations. This is a test format for students who may be able to qualify to earn a diploma, but need to submit a portfolio rather than take the test. We'll talk then briefly about how to support teachers who are conducting the MCAS-Alt and how you can oversee their progress throughout the year. And finally, a slide or two on important dates, training dates, things you need to remember, and the resources that can help you as we move forward. And then how to reach all of us at the department. So let's proceed with an MCAS overview here. And we'll talk about last school year, which was a school year in which we did several different things to ameliorate the effects of the school closures, remote learning, and the pandemic in general. We extended testing for the most part for all grades until June 11th. Students in grades 3 through 8 were assigned to take a one test session And about 20% of the students statewide in grades 3 through 8 took the test remotely, which is our first foray into this adventurous new territory of giving tests outside the school. We've never done this before. All of this is in grades 3 through 8 in high school because that's a relatively high stakes test. That test was a 2-session test administered only in schools. Similarly, we extended the MCAS-Alt submission date from April 1st to May 20th. That gave teachers another 7 weeks to submit their portfolios. The scoring occurred in June instead of in late April and early May. We tried to develop as helpful as possible materials that teachers could use to collect evidence and have parents or instruct parents how to assist in completing classroom assignments, so we could use those assignments as bona fide evidence in the portfolios. Sometimes parents coach a little too much when they're helping their child get through an assignment. This is a way to capture exactly what happened. So some of these remote learning materials are on our MCASAlt resources and training website. We reported in August this time instead of June electronically, and then at the end of September, your schools should have received printed reports for both the test and the alternate assessments. So that was just like less than 2 weeks ago. We'll be returning the portfolios to you and your schools in late October, and these need to be kept obviously securely for a duration of time that's described in the educator's manual. There's a page on how long to keep those return portfolios, and it's different for each subject and each grade level. So take a look at that and see what you're obliged to do, and if maybe some of the older portfolios could possibly be destroyed or returned to parents. So that's a one-pager in the educator's manual for MCASAlt that's also posted to the MCASAlt webpage on the department's MCAS website. For this school year, we're thinking that we're planning in any case to test students as usual. That means English, language, arts, and math in grades 3 through 8 and 10, and then science and technology engineering, which we sometimes abbreviate as STE, in grades 5, 8, and either 9 or 10 as before. So this has not changed. We're going back to this schedule. These will be assessments as we described them in the past. We may make changes to these as time marches on, but we haven't announced any changes as yet. There are some students in high school who may not have taken MCAS or MCAS-Alt at all during their high school career. There are lots of good reasons to have them participate at least once in high school, even just to sit for a retest. And imagine that you're a parent who has a child who is not receiving a diploma, and the parent is making a strong case for their ability to at least attempt to have an opportunity to receive a diploma. If they have not been tested at all, it appears that they may have been denied the opportunity to receive a diploma unfairly. So this is a way for you to cover yourselves in terms of student opportunities to participate. We want to remind those who are taking the MCAS-Alt or supervising teachers who are taking the MCAS-Alt that all of the evidence and data needs to be from this school year. It's tempting to include evidence from the past, especially from 2020, because that wasn't submitted and it's just kind of hanging around. Could we reuse it? The answer is no. You need to have evidence and data from the current school year, that's 21-22. And the only exception to this is the science and tech engineering evidence, which can be submitted from this year and the immediately previous one school year. So we accept science and tech engineering evidence from 2 years, and all others are from the current school year. And then a reminder that we pretty much always tell you that any student who's receiving a tuition that's paid for with public money, even partially, must participate in spring 22 MCAS assessments that are required for their grade. We want to let you know that there's going to be no accountability reporting. I'm intentionally uppercasing the accountability. The word accountability means that the official accountability reporting system is not going to be applied this year. We will be making all the information, though, the data from the tests, publicly available, the participation rates and the performance and achievement of students, the student growth percentiles, all that information is there. It just will not be used for leveling schools and giving each of those schools an accountability report. We're calculating student growth percentiles using a new baseline this year, a historical baseline, and it's a complex new procedure that'll be announced in more detail coming up, but I just wanted you to know about this. We'll be using this new baseline for accountability for this coming year, for 22. So we're kind of resetting the scale here for accountability reporting for the future. There was a somewhat redesigned MCAS parent report for grades 3 through 8 to reflect the fact that many of the students were tested remotely and all of them were tested on a one-session test. So that's a change that you may have noticed as well when you received your printed reports. So for students with disabilities, we want to make sure that you are aware that teams are required to discuss annually how a student will participate in MCAS in each subject. This is often a time-consuming conversation. We've tried to make it as streamlined as possible. We've given you something called the MCAS decision-making tool, which I'll show you shortly, but that's available online. And it's something that teams can use to jumpstart the conversation about assessment at the team meeting. But it stands to reason that some students who are maybe on the verge of being able to take the test, but are taking the MCASAlt might change in the future. Students in grade 3, we don't know much about their assessment histories or their ability to take tests, or are they right for the alternate assessment? Those are students who are likely to be reconsidered for the test in the future as well. So here are the options listed on this slide. These slides are available, incidentally. The links to them is provided in the email we sent you with your link to this presentation. And also they're available on the MCASAlt materials site, which we'll give you the email address for a little later on. So 2 ways to get these slides. We're also recording this so that you'll have an opportunity to tell your principals or others who are not able to join you today that they have an opportunity to listen to this at some future point. So the options for testing include the computer-based test. The paper-based test is available as an accommodation for students with disabilities or first-year English learners. There's the MCAS-Alt for students who are working well below grade level expectations, and then the grade level and competency portfolios for students who are working at grade level but need an alternative format other than the standard test to show their knowledge and skills. The IEP teams and the 504 plans all need to list these assessment decisions in the various plans, including the accommodations for each test if they're different, and alternate assessments where they're indicated as well. Once again, remember that assessments beyond grade 10 are optional, but the team needs to determine whether the student is expected to graduate and make appropriate decisions to allow that student the opportunity to participate after grade 10, but there is no requirement to do so. There are possibilities here around the MCAS appeals process, perhaps a competency portfolio, or just plain old taking the MCAS retest, or any combination of these is fine after grade 10. And so many options and pathways to earn a diploma are available for these students. For English learners, they're required as well to participate in all of these tests for their grade, except for first-year Ls. These are students who enrolled after March 1st, 2021. If they reported for the first time in June 2021 SIMS, they're not required to take the MCAS ELA test this spring. They may if they want to participate, or if the principal wants to see just how their performance is and get an analytical, diagnostic analytical review of that, they can have them take the test, but it does not count in the results of the school. There is now a list of EL accommodations. We'll be showing you those a little later in the presentation, but we want to make sure that they're not ignored in the process of considering the students' language needs, their learning preferences, and so on. And so again, this is outlined in more detail in the accommodations manual linked at the bottom of the screen here. We're all still getting used to the new MCAS scale. We've got the 200 to 280 scale locked in our brains from so many years that it's going to take a little while to refresh and realize that we're not operating on the same old needs improvement, proficient and advanced achievement levels, nor on that 200 to 280 scale any longer. We're now on a scale of between 440 and 560. 500 is the score right in the middle of that scale, which signifies a student who is meeting expectations, what we used to call proficient. And so we have new designations, we have new numbers, and we're still assimilating these and getting used to this new way of reporting on the MCAS. We also plan on administering next generation science tests in high school for the first time this spring 22. And we'll be using these designations and this scale to what we call set standards for those next generation science and technology engineering tests in 2022. So that's biology and introductory physics. The cut scores for determining partially and meeting and exceeding expectations will be set by committees this summer. So more on that to come. A little more on science and tech engineering tests and the MCAS retest. Some information we think you probably want to know is that the 5 and 8 tests are based on the next-gen standards. They're, computer-based tests with paper-based accommodations. The high school tests are a kind of a more complicated situation in which 2 of the tests, biology and introductory physics, are based on the newer standards, and chemistry and technology engineering are based on the previous set of standards. And those are paper-based tests only, where these next generation biology and physics tests are computer-based with paper-based accommodations. Now, this February, we'll be giving the legacy biology test as before. The legacy biology test is a paper-based test based on the previous standards, but then in the spring, this flips over to the new standards and a computer-based test will be offered. We're also making a similar kind of flip the switch move with our retests, where in November, there will be either next-gen computer-based tests with paper accommodation or the legacy tests for ELA and math. But then in March, we'll be moving entirely to next-gen computer-based retests. So this is a change that is long in the making. We're finally doing it, and we're phasing out these legacy tests from old sets of standards that are now no longer current. If you're involved in high school and have supervision over high school students or teachers, you're probably aware of something called the Modified Competency Determination. And this modified CD is an alternative way for students who haven't had the appropriate number of opportunities to take MCAS tests to meet the requirements for a competency determination. And there are a lot of board memos that discuss this, and a webpage on the MCAS webpage on the department's website devotes an entire page to graduation requirements. But suffice it to say that for the classes of 21 and 22, that's this year's seniors, last year's seniors as well, those competency determinations were awarded based on certification of receiving full credit on a relevant course. It's kind of like the appeals process, only not so formal. It took place for larger numbers of students than we currently serve with the appeals. And those students have been able to graduate by certifying their credit on an appropriate course. And now for next year's seniors, that would be this year's grade 11 students and this year's grade 10 students for that matter. Those students are all going back to taking the regular ELA and math MCAS tests. It's all based on the number of opportunities they've had to be tested. And so these students in 21 and 22 were deprived of at least one and sometimes more opportunities for that to happen. For science, we've extended the modified competency determination to the classes of 21 through 23. And those students are awarded essentially a competency determination if they receive full credit for a course in one of the 4 tested science disciplines. For students in other classes, they can earn a next generation test score equivalent to a 240 on the grade 10 MCAS, ELA, and math tests, and a legacy 220 on science and tech engineering, or another option is to earn an equivalent score to the 220, 238 on a either a competency portfolio or a test and fulfill the requirements of an educational proficiency plan. So this list of equivalent passing scores is available on our graduation requirement webpage, which is linked at the very bottom of this slide. And you can see what those scores might be. As far as the scholarship goes, the Adams Scholarship is awarded to the top 25% of students and students who have, on their first attempt at taking either the next gen or the legacy MCAS, ELA, and mathematics tests, achieved an appropriate score, which is generally in the proficient and or advanced category. If you haven't taken a science test due to the CD modification, we'll only use the English language arts and math scores in determining your eligibility for the scholarship. And if you have taken the science and tech engineering test prior to February 2020, we'll include your score, but only if it benefits your students. And so there are lots of different options here for meeting this requirement, but if you're taking the test for the first time, even on a retest, that counts toward the Adams Scholarship scores needed to confirm your eligibility. So let's reinforce the idea here that students with disabilities don't necessarily have a choice between online and paper testing. They should be assumed to be taking the computer-based test unless the team can demonstrate that the student is unable to do so. Paper testing is an accommodation. It needs to be listed in the plan. It needs to be based on their disability, and they'll be given a paper test as an accommodation if the plan lists it and the tests are required. Requested when it comes time to request the test. We want to remind you, though, that all tests are still untimed. Students can receive blank scratch paper or lined or graph paper as long as it's blank. Test administrators can assist students to navigate through the computer-based testing platform. But to avoid all of this lack of familiarity with the testing platform, we strongly urge all schools to have their students take practice tests and view the online tutorial on how to use the online navigation system, the online testing system, which is called TestNav. By clicking on the website at the bottom of the screen, that'll take you to a site in which you can get those practice tests, have a tutorial, and figure out whether the student can take the test on a computer or not, given a few tries, a few opportunities to take it. So IEP teams, which are now meeting and may have met already to make some of these testing decisions and assessment formatting decisions, we want to get you started early as possible on this and have you become familiar with the Accessibility and Accommodations Manual, which is updated every year, not major modifications, but we typically add a few accommodations every year. So it makes sense to know what those additions were and become familiar with who's eligible for which accessibility features and which accommodations. So we're going to need those individual decisions about accessibility features and accommodations. It may make sense to include accessibility features, which are open to everybody, but to include those in the IEP just to make sure that the student receives them. But certainly the accommodations will all need to be listed. Students with disabilities in first year ELs have some additional questions that may need to be posed here. We talked about students' ability to use a computer for the test. And again, the tutorial and practice tests are the best indicators of this. Unless the student is very facile with computers already, let's figure out if students can, in fact, learn to take these tests on a computer before they're given. There are a lot of advantages to taking it on a computer. it's a much more natural situation than taking the test on paper with multiple booklets and reference sheets and having to track where you put the answers to test items and so forth. The computer test is really much more intuitive. If you need to read aloud, one additional question you may want to ask is, can the student use text-to-speech, or do they need a human read aloud to read this to them? The text-to-speech is something that Rob will show you a little later on, but it's a feature that needs to be turned on. It needs to be requested when you request the test form for a student. But if you have it, it will read through the test to the student through headphones, and they can sit with their peers and take the test alongside others rather than needing to be broken out into a smaller group. So now I'm going to take a breath, get a drink, and turn this over to Rob, who's going to talk with you about accessibility and accommodations. Rob, take it away.
All right. Thanks, Dan. Good afternoon, everybody. As Dan mentioned, it's Robert Pellicciati. I'm the MCAS Appeals and Competency Portfolio Coordinator at the Department of Education. And I'm going to speak a little bit about the MCAS accessibility accommodations, the accessibility features that are outlined in the manual, and I'll also talk a little bit about what we call the student registration or personal needs profile, what that is, and why it is important to know about it. So let's move on to the next slide and talk a little bit about accessibility and accommodations. So in general, the MCAS Accessibility Accommodation Manual breaks down accommodations or accessibilities into 4 categories. One we call universal accessibility features, and these are either built into the computer-based test or they're available as a paper support. Someone can provide a tool to a student taking a paper test, available for all students, not just students with disabilities. Next, we'll talk a little bit about designated accessibility features. These are features that have to do with when and with whom and where a student with disability or any student will be taking a test. These are up to principal's discretions. They can be indicated on the IEP, as Dan mentioned, and we recommend they do so. A student will be guaranteed that particular accessibility feature, but it's not required to do so. So any student, regardless of disability, can also be entitled to a designated accessibility features. Next, we have accommodations. There's accommodations just for students with disabilities and English learners that are described in the manual. We also have a group of accommodations called special access accommodations. Those are formally described as non-standard accommodations. And these are special access accommodations. When providing them, they affect part of what the criteria is being measured. Therefore, there's special considerations, a special set of criteria a student needs to meet in order to receive those accommodations. All of the accessibility features and accommodations are explained more thoroughly in a training module. If you use this link in your slides that are sent out to you, you'll be able to obtain this narrated training module. So let's talk a little bit about what's new and notable. So for students who have a accommodation, students with disabilities that have an accommodation for a graphic organizer or reference sheet, we have pre-approved graphic organizers and reference sheets that are available for the English language arts and mathematics tests that are available on our website. We strongly suggest that students with this accommodation take a look at these earlier in the school year so they're familiar with the accommodations, how to use these reference sheets and graphic organizers for the upcoming test. It's really important for students to familiarize themselves with them if they have those listed on their IEPs. Please know that these are pre-approved, meaning that information cannot be added to the English language arts or mathematics reference sheets, but it's certainly available an option to omit references, print these on larger paper, so you can take information out and just can't edit information. It's also permissible for a student who is taking an English language arts test to use a textless organizer, something with boxes or grids, bullet points. That could be permitted as long as there's no words. For students taking science, technology, engineering test, this permissible to use a customized reference sheet. So we still have that available option where an educator could work with the student and they could devise a particular mnemonic system, a guide to remember certain facts, understanding, and that can be submitted for departmental approval. Moving on to what we call web extensions. We had this last year, we also have it this year. We have a built-in system in the computer-based test for students who are using speech-to-text or word prediction, where they would not need a separate device. So they could use a speech-to-text program or word prediction program for the English language arts or science, technology, engineering, computer-based test that's embedded into the program. And I'll provide a more detailed description later on in the presentation or some screenshots of that. For the past few years, we've had what we call American Sign Language form or video version of the grade 10 mathematics test. For this spring, for the high school science test, the biology, introductory physics, we will also have an American Sign Language version. So many of you may not be familiar with that, but that's a really good option for our students who communicate in sign language, who find that test content they're much more able to use it using their native communication system. And for educators who are working with students who are learning Braille, we've transitioned to the Unified English Braille American Edition from, or I should say UEB from EBAE, which is, we transitioned to Unified English Braille from English Braille American Edition. So all tests for spring 2022 will be in UEB. So we're talking a little bit about accommodated test forms. What does that mean? So for accessibility features and a lot of accommodations, these can be provided to any student who are taking the computer-based or paper-based test. So it can be added to the standard test form. There are certain test forms that have to be ordered specifically in the student registration person use profile, or specifically for the student because they are a specific test form. Test forms such as text-to-speech for the computer-based test, the American Sign Language version, which I mentioned earlier, a screen reader version that's only for students who are blind and use a third-party software called JAWS or NVDA. There's also the web extension form, as I mentioned earlier. So students who are using speech-to-text or word prediction, this has to be ordered in advance so they can have the correct test form to use that. Or if they're using a specific assistive technology program that's compatible, maybe they're using Zoom text and they're taking their test on a very a screen with a computer with a large monitor, that also has to be indicated. That's considered a specific accommodated test form for computer-based tests. We have some paper-based test forms that are accommodated as well, such as large print, Braille test form. There's also a paper-based test form for students in high school taking a Spanish-English grade 10 mathematics test. Those are English learners that have been in the country for less than 3 years. There's also the biology that will be available. It's new this year in Spanish-English, as well as introductory physics. For just this fall only, the November retest, there's still an option for Kurzweil tests. So you'll see on the next screen, the universal accessibility features. This just lists out the universal accessibility features that are highlighted in the manual. On the next couple slides, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these more specific universal accessibility features, give you an example of what they look like. But if you look at the slide, it just lays out the information, accessibility features for you that are available for the computer-based and paper-based tests. On the left hand, there's computer-based accessibility features, which are specific to computer-based tests. Some have an equivalent, most of them an equivalent paper-based feature. So let's see some examples of some of these accessibility features. For students taking the computer-based test, there's a highlighter tool that's built into the computer-based test. Any student could use these on these particular tests, and there's 4 colors to choose from. You could see a student going through English language arts test, and let's say, for example, they want to highlight a specific voice, someone speaking in a specific color. They could use a color, for example, here, blue for line 12. They could use, which would be orange the next, and green and pink. So you can see how a student could use this to help organize their thoughts. If they wanted to prepare something for an essay, highlight information they think is important based on a question later on the test. Therefore, important for a student to be somewhat familiar with this and practice ahead of time. It would really help them on the day of the test if they plan to use this, the highlighter tool. There's also an option for an alternate cursor or mouse pointer. So what is that? Well, that's an option that's indicated in the SRPNP. And the student who perhaps has a visual impairment, maybe a visual challenge, is used to having a larger cursor and mouse. They want to use that to move around the screen. This would be selected ahead of time, and they could have options from which would be the default, the standard one, to medium, large, extra large, and also could be in different colors. So you can see how this could be used by a student who maybe has a visual challenge or maybe a tracking challenge. They want to see how they move using the mouse around the screen. And as I mentioned before, this has to be indicated in the SRPNP ahead of time. So order for the students, so when they log onto their test, they'll have the option for this, the alternate cursor and mouse pointer. On this particular slide, we'll talk a little about the change background and font color. Also for students who have a visual challenge, if we upload this information, you can see what it looks like. This would have to be indicated in the SRPNP. And Kevin, I think you have to click next for the rest of the information to appear. So if this is indicated for student or SRPNP, they'd have the option to change the contrast settings. That contrast settings could be loaded ahead of time, but when they logged onto the test, they're able to choose the particular contrast they may find, whether that's more visually appealing to the student or just easier for them to track the information. Student does not need to have a disability to have this. Again, this is an accessibility feature, but you could see how this particular one on the bottom part of the screen, you could see the text is in white and the background is in black. There's also option for a variety of different colors. They could have black on light blue, black on light magenta, white on black, or yellow on blue. So we strongly suggest students take a look at this in the practice test if this is something that's going to be ordered for them. Students with a visual challenge, or just really they really prefer the screen in different contrast. You may find this really advantageous on the day of the test. This is an example of the line reader tool available to any student. So this tool, you can see in the bottom half of the screen, allows certain text to be masked and allows students to read information line by line. This can be moved around the screen. It can also be enlarged. So a student could use this again if they find a lot of information on a screen visually distracting. If they want to use it to track the reading line by line, they can do that as well. This is an example of the answer eliminator tool for multiple choice questions, for multiple choice options. A student would just select or make a little X mark by clicking this tool for the answer options they deem are incorrect. So if they can eliminate the answer options they find they're easily incorrect, and they could choose from the one they feel is the most appropriate. Just allow students to mimic what they could potentially do on a paper-based test. Instead of crossing through an item, they could use this answer eliminator tool. Again, available for all students. I'm going to talk a little bit about designated accessibility features. I mentioned earlier, these have to do with whom, when, and where a student was taking the test. Again, any student can take advantage of a designated accessibility feature at the principal's discretion. However, if you want to ensure a student with disability receives a particular small group or individual test location, we strongly advise it's listed on the IEP. Therefore, if a particular educator working with the student is not there the day of the test, they can ensure that the student receives that particular accommodation. Those accessibility feature. And here's a list just listed on your screen. These are all described in the accessibility features and accommodation manual. There are a list of accommodations just for students with disabilities. As I mentioned earlier, this particular slide describes ones we call test presentation accommodations. On the left-hand side of your screen, you'll see computer-based test presentation accommodations and their paper-based equivalent. You could see how there is a accommodation that Dan mentioned earlier for text-to-speech, which is electronic read aloud. There's also a human signer accommodation. So a human signer could sign the test content to students. And I mentioned earlier the ASL videos. But let's go on to the next slide and see an example of the text-to-speech. What does that look like? So if this was selected for a student with disability, this is considered a standard accommodation for the math and science test, a non-standard or specialized accommodation, I should say, for the English language arts test. The student would have this particular control icon appear on their screen, and this icon would allow the student to select a passage of text or the top of the screen and click play, and then the test would be read to the student. In this particular segment of screen, you can see the test being, the line being highlighted and the word being read aloud in blue at that time. We don't have the ability right now to give you a live demo, but if you go to the practice test, you can certainly look at text-to-speech practice test and try this tool out yourself, and also have the students try this tool out. There's options for the student to change the reading rate level, so it can be read at fast or late, and also skip sections of the test. Within the text-to-speech tool, there's also an option to what we call highlight and listen. Therefore, if a student could hover over a particular aspect of the text, highlight that text, and you can see in the middle part of the screen, the icon that says listen. If they selected that listen icon and clicked on it with their mouse or cursor, that particular part of the text would be read to the student. Again, this would have to be indicated in the student's SRPNP for the student to experience this on the day of the test. There are what we call response accommodations as well. These accommodations have to do with how the student responds to the particular test item. As I mentioned earlier, the students with disabilities can also take advantage or use what we call English language arts graphic organizer, or for mathematics test, a reference sheet. Those are available. The pre-approved ones are available on our website. There's also accommodation for a scribe. I mentioned earlier the student could have a scribe, or which would be the equivalent accommodation would be a speech-to-text device, a device where a student would dictate their particular responses. And the list goes on and on here. There's also still an accommodation for a type response. One would wonder why a student would need a paper-based test with a type response, because there is a computer-based test. So if you have a student with that particular accommodation, educator providing that for a student, you have to ask them little questions. Why would that be accommodation that would be necessary for a student? Because there is a computer-based test where they theoretically could obviously type all their answers, but perhaps there's a particular aspect of the computer-based test where the student cannot access through their disability. Therefore, we still have this accommodation available. On the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit more about the web extensions I mentioned earlier that we have. These are relatively new, therefore I wanted to provide more of a detailed description. So for example, if a student needs to use a speech-to-text device, or they need to use word prediction for the English language arts test, these are now embedded into the particular computer-based test on TestNav. If this was selected in the student's SRP&P, student registration personal needs profile, for that student, when they logged into their test, this would be the first screen they would see. So the students want to install a particular web extension tool. There's two of them available. One would be considered the co-writer universal tool. The other is the read and write tool on TestNav. The student would click install if the one they chose, and then you would see the next screen. Let's say, for example, the student was more familiar with read and write, the web extension tool. This would be the options that would appear for their test. It would give an option to add that particular extension, and it shows the icons that are available to the student. The co-writer icons are very similar, but a little different. If a student was more familiar with these ones, they would build a co-writer icon. And the co-writer icon gives them an opportunity to select either speech to text or word prediction, or select both. So you want to be making sure that an educator is working one-on-one with the student, but so they know which one they need to select. You can see in the middle part of your screen, the speech to text control bar. Now this would appear when there's an open response box. So a student with this particular web extension accommodation, when they came to a question with the open response box, this particular icon would appear, and when they selected the little microphone, it would allow them to speak their answers. The word prediction tool is not a predict ahead, but it predicts based on what they're typing. So here in this particular icon, this box, this response box, the student started typing TH, and these answer options appear, or word options appear for the student to select. So that's the word prediction tool. Again, for students with these accommodations, we strongly suggest they practice ahead of time. We have these web extension practice tests available on our website, the MCAS Resource Center. And again, if students are going to use these, it would really take the advantage from the practice ahead of time. I mentioned earlier that we have what we call special access accommodations. Special access accommodations were formerly called non-standard accommodations. In this group of accommodations, we reserve a particular reserve for students with a specific disability or specific level of disability to get these accommodations, because they affect part of what the test construct is trying to measure. So if a student were to get a read aloud or text to speech on the English language arts test, obviously it's a test of reading and reading comprehension. If they receive that accommodation, it affects the score. Obviously, it would be hard to determine what their actual decoding skills is because it reads a test for them. So these are reserved for only students who are considered virtual non-read readers, students reading about the mid first grade or below first grade level could be eligible for these particular accommodations. Again, the criteria for these accommodations are listed in the Accessibility Accommodations Manual. And it's just really important to be aware of this, making sure that educators are not assigning these particular accommodations to students who don't require them, and also not mistakenly assigning these particular special access accommodations, because if they're provided to a student that is not required to receive them on their IEP, their test scores could be invalidated. This is an example of the spell checker tool. Now, the spell checker tool is available for any student for the science, technology, engineering tests, but only for students with disabilities with a special access accommodation for the English language arts test. It functions similar to most with spell checker tools in the sense of a word is misspelled, you would see a red squiggly line underneath it. They would click on that spell check and it would give them a variety of options to choose of where they can choose here for the misspelled word. We mentioned earlier there are accommodations available just for English learners, students designated as English learners. They could take advantage also of accommodations. They don't necessarily need to be a student with disability. There's a variety of them listed here, which would be text-to-speech or human reader, just for the math or science, technology, engineering test, not for the English language arts test. There's a scribe. This year we have, in addition to a grade 10 test in English and Spanish, there's also going to be the biology and physics test, an introductory physics test in Spanish and English. Any student who is an English learner or former English learner, a FEL, sometimes how they're referred to, also could use an approved bilingual word-to-word dictionary. A list of those are available on our website. We have here a little note for step testing policy. What does that mean? Well, it means if you have a student that's new to the school, who are uncertain what their particular skill level is, and you give them the MCAS test, they arrive before testing, it's always a good option to give them the test to see how they're doing. But if they're unable to progress after a period of like 15, 20 minutes, they don't have to sit there in the testing environment all day. You can move them on to another activity. I mentioned earlier that I'm going to talk a little bit about the student registration personal needs profile. What is it? Well, this is our system to register students for specific tests, order tests for the students, and obtain demographic information. In January, what the department will do is provide in the school's Dropbox a list of students that are registered for the particular spring tests. These lists will include students' accommodation history that we have. So they're going to be pre-populated. It will indicate the tests that they should be registered for. And what districts will do is they'll look at this information, determine, they'll verify the accuracy. Okay, so for example, is a student who is in grade 5, there's a student from grade 5 who had the test before, does a student truly need text-to-speech? They had it before, text-to-speech for math test, and do they now need it? Also, accommodations may need to be changed at that time, so they'll verify the accommodations, and they'll make sure the students have the right test ordered and ahead of time. If you have questions about the SRP&P, please let me know. We can certainly discuss it later. It's important to know that we will update this particular file based on information we have. Obviously, for students who are in grade 3, we don't have any information on them as far as their accommodations. Therefore, the particular SRP&P file would not be pre-populated for those students. We are going to offer additional trainings on the SRP&P. We had one a few weeks ago that's available on the website, the MCAS Resource Center, and they'll have additional ones this spring. Oops, sorry, I turned my camera off a little too quickly. That will be the end of my particular discussion on accessibility features and accommodation. I'm going to turn it over to Dan, who's going to speak a little bit about the MCAS-Alt.
Thanks, Rob. That's very helpful information, I think, as teams begin their meetings to determine how students will participate in MCAS this particular spring, among other decisions they'll have to make. We're going to talk now, switch gears, talk now about the MCAS alternate assessment. Let's move to the next slide. The MCAS alternate assessment obviously is for students with significant cognitive disabilities who are unable to take standard MCAS tests, even with accommodations. And there are some very specific criteria for who those students are and what kinds of characteristics they need to exhibit in order to participate. The reason we're doing this alternate assessment is, of course, because it's the law, but we also want to make sure that these kids are included in all activities, or to the extent possible, the activities of a school, and have access to all of the resources of a school. We want to make sure that they receive instruction in the standards at a level that is meaningful for them, and also doesn't pander to them and teach them things they already know, but to continue on the march up the moving staircase toward greater and greater proficiency in the precious amount of time that we have with them. We also want to know what they have learned of what they have been taught. And the MCASAlt really is a snapshot of that instruction. It's not fully inclusive of everything teachers teach them. We know that. But let's find out exactly what they've learned or what they've been taught. And finally, we need to include information on these students when we talk about reporting to the public, to parents, to schools, on the achievement of students with disabilities, and in particular, students with significant cognitive disabilities. The MCASAlt is predicated on the idea of an essence of the standard. The standards are the standards. We need to teach them to all students, but the essence of the standard can be teased out along a continuum of complexity, leading from the standard as it's written all the way on the right side of the screen, and then in successively less complex and difficult chunks to match the appropriate level of the standard to each student. And so right down to the fact that students who are the most significantly cognitively disabled in the state are tracking geometric shapes, while other students are working on volume formulas for geometric forms and shapes. It's the teacher's job to select the correct level at which to assess the student on that particular standard. The domain or strand or topic or area is mandated by the state, and they select those entry points within each one. And most portfolio strands require the submission of several things. One is called the MCAS-Alt Skill Survey, which we'll show you in a moment in a little more depth and some detail. That needs to be completed for each student in the required strands. Then a data chart on a student's performance over a period of time, measuring their accuracy and independence in learning a new skill on at least 8 different dates. And then 2 work samples or photographs or video or other snapshots in time of exactly what the student was asked to do and how they did it. We ask for 2 pieces because we want to see not only data charts, but we want to actually see the products of instruction. And so this is called the core set of evidence: the data chart, the 2 pieces of evidence, and the skills survey. There's an exception to this. One is ELA writing, which is a little bit different, and the science and technology engineering, which is different because it includes science practices as well as science content. So we'll touch very briefly on each of these and just keep moving along here so that you get the sky-high view of the alternate assessment. We get a lot of questions about, what are these data charts? What are they designed to do? What's the point of them? As we mentioned, these reflect the selection of an appropriate entry point for a student that shows their successive learning of a skill over a period of time. Here, the student is determining the meaning of common suffixes with 85% accuracy and 85% independence. That's the teacher's goal for the student, at which point he or she would move the student to another skill. It's agreed that students would have mastered the skill at that particular point. And the red and the blue bars are for accuracy and independence. And below each of these dates, each of these sets of bars, are brief descriptions and a date in which each activity occurred. So we can tell a lot from these data charts. Let's move to the next slide. We can tell whether a student is using, for example, something called zero prompt instruction, which you may all know about. The student is always independent and they're working on their level of accuracy. The independence is the blue bar. So obviously the red bar we're watching to see if it increases over time. In this particular chart, it did. So it was having its desired effect. And we know what's going on in the classroom, roughly, generally, from looking at the charts that are submitted by the teacher. Another example is called errorless instruction, errorless teaching. And in this, we set the accuracy bar at 100%. We always want the student to be correct, but with decreasing levels of prompting. We can see the students' independence climbing over time to the point where they're virtually able to show and demonstrate their knowledge of this skill with very little prompting and assistance. And so we see the independence bar starting low and hopefully ending high at the end. Sometimes we see charts in which a teacher is working in several different methods of instruction. This is a combination of errorless teaching and zero prompt instruction, in which the student is turned loose on the first date to show what he knows with complete independence. Show me how you can perform on this. I'm not going to give you any help. Let me know how you can do. Student got 0% accuracy. And that happened on the second date too. And then on the third date, the teacher decided to prompt and assist the student. And that went on for 3 or 4 or 5 times. And the student's accuracy level started to go up. And then you can see by the end, he was at fully accurate response, but 80% independence. And so we learned here that the student's method of learning and the teacher's method of teaching were somewhat heterogeneous. Here's a data chart in which I would ask the question, what does this data chart tell you about the student's achievement? Looking at this particular chart, we start low on accuracy and independence and very quickly rise up to the 80 or 80+% level of accuracy and independence. Click ahead, Kev, and we'll see the answer. The answer will be revealed. Obviously, this student mastered the skill after 2 or 3 attempts, and it was probably too easy of a skill that was selected by the teacher. And it would be better to spend the time teaching students more challenging skills and taking longer to get to the point where they're able to fully independently demonstrate an accurate performance instead of hitting their stride at the second opportunity. This is now 6 or 7 different times the teacher was working on skills that the student obviously could already perform. Okay. I mentioned that ELA writing was an exception to the rule of the core set of evidence. We're really determined to make sure that every student, even the most significantly disabled students, have a mode of instruction that allows them to expressively communicate their ideas, their feelings, their beliefs, their arguments. And so we have set in place a requirement for the annual ELA writing assessment, that's part of ELA, obviously, along with language and reading, to provide 3 writing samples in any text type, obviously listed below, that's pre-scored by the teacher, and the scorers check the teacher's work on this scoring rubric for these 3 writing samples. So the writing can be either an opinion or a preference or an argument, making a claim and backing it up with some information that they may have extracted from a text. There's an informational or informative explanatory text where they're merely summarizing information they may have seen, read, or heard. Or a narrative, which is a story. They're telling a story, and that includes poetry. So these 3 writing types are what we set in place as our goal to have students submit. Only 3 samples are required throughout the entire year, but this is a way to ensure that the student has some communication system in place. And obviously, this can be any one of a number of different areas of ways of communicating, communication books, assistive technology devices, symbol systems, sign language, whatever it might be. That's the importance to us of the ELA writing and why it makes sense for me to share this with you. The skills survey was put in place last year for the first time, new in 21. It's still a requirement. It's a series of preliminary skills, prerequisite skills on which the student is briefly and informally assessed before the teacher selects an entry point that's appropriate for that particular student. And it's on a range of skills in the required strand and domain. So you conduct this thing several times, depending on the strand or math domain that you're assessing. And then the teacher would select their entry points based on the results of the skills survey. Now we've gotten some very positive feedback. It's an additional step, obviously, for teachers to conduct, but it's extremely helpful in streamlining the selection process for the entry points. And we want to see that the skills survey was conducted, so we require this in the beginning of each strand of the portfolio. The score depends on it. If it's not there, the score will be M, as we call it, or incomplete. We just don't have sufficient information on which to base a score. And so this helps teachers become familiar with the full range of standards and skills and possible entry points, and helps them to select appropriate and challenging entry points and access skills for each student. Discourages choosing those entry points that are a little too easy. Okay. Next slide, please. The skills survey looks like this. There are about 10 or 12 different skills listed in a grid. And then there are 5 columns, A through E, in which the lowest column is a student who cannot perform the skill at all. The larger, as you move up the chain from A to B to C to D, we talk about the student rarely being able to perform the skill, or occasionally, or more often than not, or almost always. And for each skill, they begin at lower level complexity and end at higher level complexity. And so you'd expect that the earlier skills might be the place where students would be in columns D and E, where they're able to perform these skills more often than not, or almost all of the time. And you can see that in columns, in rows 1 and 2, that's the case. But further down on the chart, you can see that there are X's in the columns A, B, and C. And this means that less than 50% of the time, the student is able to perform this skill. And we require teachers to select entry points from columns A, B, or C. Some entry point, like the ones that are circled here or that have an X in the column, A, B, and C, or something related to these entry points are the ones that we want to see in the portfolio. If we're choosing skills from columns D and E, then we're likely to hit those, like the data chart we saw where the skill was learned very quickly, where the student performed the skill independently and accurately from the beginning. And so this is our way of including a standardized component in the alternate assessment that all teachers are required to do, and including this piece in the portfolio. The portfolio scores, the MCAS-Alt scores, are reported using a series of what we call alternate academic achievement standards. They're not the same achievement standards as those used on the MCAS test. You'll see they look different. And they describe a student who is working on standards-based skills at a variety of different levels, 3 different levels, very little understanding, simple understanding of a limited number of standards, or partial understanding of several standards below grade level expectations. And it just talks to their ability to perform these skills consistently and accurately. And so each one of these goes up in progression. Obviously, there is a designation of incomplete portfolios, which is a considerable number of portfolios each year, but hopefully something that we can remediate with better training. But that means that insufficient evidence and information was provided in the portfolio to determine an achievement level. Just a cautionary note, some people call progressing passing, and it's curious to me because they're not really passing, they're getting the highest score on the alternate assessment, but it doesn't mean they have met the requirements of the criteria to earn a competency determination and receive a portfolio. They're still working below the level required for that, below grade level expectations. And so they haven't yet achieved a score that's necessary to get a competency determination. Schools receive a disproportionate amount of credit for the students that they serve in their building who take alternate assessments. We know that it can positively impact the school's accountability. But these are still scores that are reported back to schools and districts in the lowest performance level, either not meeting expectations or warning or failing for the legacy tests. So just to clarify that, I thought that would be important. Let's look at the results from the MCAS-Alt last year briefly. We'll show you the statewide results first. It looks like the number of students who participated last year in the alternate were about 1,200 fewer than participated in 2019. I think we would expect that given the kind of year we had where it was just very difficult to collect a sufficient amount of evidence, if any, from students with significant cognitive disabilities who were receiving instruction remotely. Fortunately, schools reopened in April, and those students were able to receive in-person instruction, and we received many more portfolios that teachers were able to create that began in spring as schools were beginning to reopen. And so we got as high as 6,252, but in 2019 it was significantly higher. And we can also see that in each subject, the number in ELA and math, for example, went down by about 1,000 from what it was in 2019. Again, probably to be expected, but interesting that the number proportionally to the number of students who participated in MCAS was a little bit lower, only a little bit lower than it had been the year before. 1.3% of all students who participated on the test took the MCAS-Alt in 2021. That's a little bit lower than 2019. We trained about 3,000 teachers, down from about 4,100 in 2020. We want to tell you that all of the training so far as we've been able to schedule and plan it for this year for the MCAS-Alt will be virtual. So we are going through a series of virtual trainings for teachers, and now these administrator overviews are all planned to be virtual as will be the January portfolios in progress. If we put all of the subjects, all of the grades for the MCAS-Alt together last year for the past 4 years, this is what the charts would look like. And you can see that in general, we'll start on the right side. In general, we had been hovering around 70% of portfolios receiving a score for progressing. This year that was down in large part because of a relatively higher number of incomplete portfolios. If we carve down that number, 16% for incomplete, down to the average of about 10, and added that 6% onto the progressing, which we would likely be able to do, we think we would get up to almost the level we were before. We also see slightly higher numbers in emerging and in awareness. That could be because one of the 2 or 3 required strands may have been incomplete while another 1 or 2 were complete and scoreable. And so the average of the 3 strands would go down to emerging or awareness. But in any case, this is the profile of the MCAS-Alt portfolios, not including 2020 when the assessment was canceled. And of course, it's our goal to get our number of incompletes back down and the number of progressing a little bit higher. And we're really being aggressive with our training this year, making sure that that happens. As far as eligibility for the MCAS-Alt, we want to say the following, that there has been a renewed emphasis on students and meeting certain criteria to take an alternate assessment. You probably know the federal government has imposed a cap of 1% of all assessed students, or I should say 1% of students who took the test, taking the MCAS-Alt. We've been working aggressively and steadily toward lowering that number, and we've been fairly successful. We were at 1.8% in 2016. We're now down to 1.3%. And so we're doing a good job, thanks to you, making stronger decisions on which students should probably not be taking the alternate assessment. So we lay this out for you here, that a student must have a significant cognitive disability. They're working on learning standards that were substantially modified because of the severity of their disability. They're receiving intensive and individualized instruction across most or all settings, and they're unable to demonstrate knowledge and skills on a standardized test like the MCAS, even with accommodations. And again, these are decisions that are made annually in each content area. Here's a long list of criteria that should not be used to determine whether a student should take an alternate assessment. Someone who's a transient student, someone who's an English learner, someone who's absent a lot, students who took it last year because it's an annual decision, it's not automatic. They're in a group of kids who take the alternate, so why shouldn't they? Of course they should, but not so fast. There are lots of reasons why students take the alternate assessment who probably shouldn't, but that number is getting smaller thanks to your being very watchful about who these students should be. We just spoke about the 1% cap. We want to make sure you know that our numbers are coming down. We're still not at 1% yet, and therefore we need to apply for waivers every year from the U.S. Department of Education. But the waiver is granted based on showing progress toward lowering that number. So I'm requesting that we continue to look at students to maintain their participation rate and also make sure they meet the criteria for taking the MCAS-Alt. So we're not counting students who take these grade level or competency portfolios. We're only counting students who take the MCAS-Alt. And this has been a good opportunity for us to revisit and refine decision-making and guidance for teams on making those decisions on who should take the ALT. Next slide, please. This is a graphic showing which students take the MCAS-Alt, and you can intuit from this that the larger slices of this circle graph are those that are probably more appropriate to take it. We see neurological, multiple disabilities, intellectual disabilities, and autism as the largest categories. And these categories contain students who either have a significant cognitive disability or present as if they have a significant cognitive disability. These slivers of students in the health category, the emotional, specific learning disabilities, sensory categories of vision and hearing, physical disabilities, those are students that we should be looking at to make sure that they meet the criteria. So we're laying out the breadcrumbs here. We're looking at students whose disabilities fall into categories that are not primarily thought of as having significant cognitive disabilities as a component. So a student with a communication disability, maybe they could take the test with accommodations and extended time and so forth, and they would have a chance to become eligible to earn a diploma in the process. Students who take the MCAS-Alt are bona fide working well below grade level expectations. Different set of numbers here. Don't want to confuse you with this, but I want you to see that according to our analysis of each disability category, for example, only 29% of all students with autism are taking the MCAS-Alt. You would think that it might be much higher, and in some districts it is much higher. And so we also want to point districts to these numbers and make sure that their numbers of students with autism, for example, are not demonstrably higher than these the number right here. If they're assessing 50% of their autistic students on the MCAS-Alt, maybe they should be looking at the level of need and severity of disability for those students. The others I can draw your attention to are intellectual. 50% of students with intellectual disabilities are taking the MCAS-Alt. In some districts it's higher, some lower, but that's another area to look at. Also, if you're assessing students who are deaf, who are blind, who have specific learning disabilities, who have head injuries, who have multiple disabilities, keep these numbers in mind as a general guidepost for what your numbers should be. Look at your numbers. Your districts are unique and individual. They don't have to match these. This is not a requirement on which you might be monitored, but this is broad and general guidance for you in making these decisions. So very briefly, if you have a student who you're questioning whether they should actually be taking the MCAS-Alt, they're right on the edge. We want to remind you that the test assesses many more standards. That's the default decision, not the MCAS-Alt. We shouldn't assume they're taking the MCAS-Alt. Do we get some information on their knowledge and skills on the standard MCAS? And if so, that still may be the better way for them to participate. Could they eventually achieve grade level standards given the appropriate instruction and support? This is a key question for many districts because students are often segregated and don't have access to the general curriculum the same way that non-disabled peers do. But this is something to keep in mind. We want to make sure that teams are making defensible decisions that take into consideration the least dangerous assumptions or the most optimistic assessment of what the student is able to accomplish. There's some resources that are available posted to this specific website that ends in the acronym ESSA, that's Every Student Succeeds Act, and how it relates to the MCAS-Alt. There's guidance on these criteria. There's something called the decision-making tool. There are sample parent notification letters and training for teams. And there's also a data chart that's not yet been updated for 2021 that shows 2017 through 2019 and the rate of participation and the numbers in each district. So that's worth a look as well. Let's go to the next page and look at this decision-making tool. We don't have to review every single line of it, but this, as general guidance, as we have met across the state in the large districts with the team chairs, we have given them to understand that this will really jumpstart the conversation about assessment at the team meeting. There's a series of questions that need to be answered yes or no that lead you and guide you to the next step, and then ultimately to one of three formats for participating in MCAS: the test with or without accommodations, the MCAS-Alt, or the competency and grade level portfolios. So this is a tool that we want in the hands of every team as they go into their meetings. And it's available at the website on the previous slide. Next slide, please. All right, Rob's here to talk with you very briefly because we're closing in on the end time here about grade level and competency portfolios, and then I'll be back to close it up.
All right, thanks, Dan. Dan's correct. Very briefly, I'll just mention grade level and competency portfolios. What are they? Well, for students that don't fall in the category of a typical MCAS-Alt, meaning they don't have a significant intellectual impairment. However, these students have some particular skill. They have some skills that are at or near grade level, but we know due to their disability, their significant disability, they can't participate in the standard test, on-demand test. What options do we have for these students? So for those students who are at or near grade level, but due to their significant disability, they can't take the standard test, the on-demand test. There is an option for what we call the grade level or competency portfolio. Grade level portfolios we consider our students for grades 3 through 8, and competency portfolios are students at high school. Now, these type of portfolios are based on the grade level standards, and they're collected in a similar way as the MCAS-Alt, in that you're collecting work samples, but a student can earn equivalent score on the MCAS test, meaning that they could earn a score of partially meeting expectations, or exceeding expectations. Whereas they took the standard MCAS-Alt, they could not possibly obtain a score of above not meeting expectations, because MCAS-Alt by definition is based on alternate achievement levels, which are below the grade level standards. I'll just mention briefly that on this particular slide, if you were to look at that slide, click here, that will take you to the grade level and competency portfolio manual, and you can review the requirements for a grade level and competency portfolio. Talking a little bit about who should be considered or who could be considered for a grade level or competency portfolio. There's about 3 groups of students. Perhaps a student has a significant emotional or behavior disability. These particular students have really low frustration tolerance. You know, they can't sit or participate for a standard test, but they have at or near grade level skills. A student could have a significant health disability or a neurological disorder. They don't have the ability to sustain concentration long enough, or perhaps these students have a significant motor or communication challenge or a standard routine testing, they're unable to show the skills, unable to show what they know. So basically, this is a good option for these type of students or students who fit a similar type of profile, who we know we can't accurately assess their skills to the standard test, but they could use this grade level or competency portfolio to gain a good assessment, a good kind of like dipstick, for if you will, about their particular skills, and they're allowed to earn a score that's equivalent to the standard test. I'll talk a little bit about what tasks need to be taken for students who are educators, I should say, who are compiling a grade level or competency portfolio. Here's a list of tasks. Probably one of the most important things, besides starting the beginning year of determining who should be, what kind of students would be a good candidate for this portfolio, is the understanding that we need to first understand not just who should be considered for this portfolio, but how are we going to start about collecting evidence? Who are we going to work together with? Are we going to collaborate with the special educator, the general educator, the curriculum coordinator? Often educators who are special educators who are designating students for grade level or competency portfolios may not be content level experts. Therefore, it's really important that they collaborate with other staff in their school, curriculum coordinators, who can help them understand how to develop a particular quiz or assessment that's based on the grade level standards that assesses each aspect. You have to also make sure you're familiar with the submission requirements. I'm not going to read all of the particular numbers on this particular page, but you can use this as a reference. It's also important to know that for students who are at the high school level, who were considering a competency portfolio, or they have taken the test, they've been unable to reach what we call the competency determination score, there's also an option for a cohort appeal, which is an appeal based on a student's grade point average. Or in addition to a competency portfolio, they can submit a portfolio appeal, which is a similar level of a collection of work samples that can be submitted after a student participates than so many times in the MCAS standard test or competency portfolio. And if you have any questions about appeals or competency portfolios, please let me know, as well as grade level portfolios. We can talk about it after, but I want to give everyone a little treetops views of the grade level competency portfolio.
Thanks, Rob. A few words on supporting teachers and monitoring their progress as their supervisors that you are on the MCAS-Alt. Let's keep track of the fact that portfolios don't compile themselves without a fair amount of support at the school level. And I tell my teachers during their educator trainings that I advocate on their behalf to administrators at any and all opportunities. And so I'm doing that right now to inform that principals or supervisors, special ed supervisors, whoever they may be, can encourage teachers to start their portfolios early each year. Don't wait till February or March. That's going to be a lot of craziness. You're going to make them really frantic by the end of the year. So start early. Encourage teachers to attend their training and to attend portfolio review sessions that occur in later in January and then in February and March. There are training specialists that we have, probably about 60 or 70 teachers with high quality portfolios over the last 2 years have applied to become training specialists. You may want to consider one of those to become a training specialist next year. We've already selected training specialists for the current school year. And we want to also figure out an ongoing strategy to provide and promote time for teachers to work on these portfolios through some sort of flexible scheduling, designating other staff, paraprofessionals, related service providers to assist teachers, offering occasional sub coverage. Some schools have permanent subs, others have occasional subs, but in any case, classroom coverage, so that can occur, but some kind of planning time or devoted time, maybe each week, to putting portfolios together would be very, very appreciated. And then when the results come out, scheduled for mid-June, online in the Dropbox on the Internet Security Portal, download those portfolio feedback forms and share them with the teachers so they know how they did as early as possible in the in the game. Next slide, please. We should be keeping track of teachers and how they're doing and checking in with teachers periodically. Take a look at a portfolio or two just to spot check and see if they're on task and on target. Figure out which teachers need help and who's going to provide that. Perhaps there's a more experienced teacher in the building or someone who can contact the department, or the teacher themselves can contact the department. We'll be happy to help them individually to answer their questions. We want to make sure these portfolios are complete and that they include the authentic work of the student. Principals are signing off on this, so this becomes a topic of self-interest as well. You may want to look at the brief descriptions and see if they address the measurable outcome or if they're off topic and not going to be scoreable. We want to verify that no classroom activities are dated on days that school was not in session, school vacations, Thanksgiving, Christmas, unless they're labeled as homework. And ask teachers to ensure that they've reviewed the educator's manual and maybe even been to one of our educator trainings. There's a few more coming up. They may also want to review each other's portfolios. This is a strategy that works in many schools where they have a portfolio review day with each other and they ask each other questions and look at what's in there. So these are just a real quickie bulleted list of strategies that we found effective as we met with teachers around the state. Some resources and contacts for you, information on how to get more information basically here. We'll look first at the possibilities of ongoing information and expertise at your disposal. There's a Student Assessment Services update that's a bi-weekly newsletter that's emailed automatically to principals and special ed administrators and English language learner directors. You can subscribe to that if you wish. If you get a principal to forward this to you, at the bottom of the update is a way to subscribe so that you get this. There's often information in there about the MCAS-Alt, about accommodations and requesting accommodated test forms. The MCAS Accessibility and Accommodations webpage, which is devoted solely to issues pertaining to MCAS test accommodations. All the reference sheets are found there. The concussion policy is found there. All our manuals are found there, and other information having to do with accessibility and accommodations. The MCASAlt newsletter is mailed out about every other month. It features an administrator's corner that's specifically for principals and administrators. We send this to everyone who's ever been on a training or to a training, and for whom we have an email address, and also to administrators of special education. There are MCASAlt manuals and training opportunities at our resources and training webpage on the department's MCAS alternate assessment page. Particularly the principals manual for MCASAlt gives a nice overview of all of the things principals need to be careful of and aware of as they proceed through this. And then the MCAS webpage in general, which I think you've probably all seen at one time or another. This is what the MCAS alternate assessment page looks like. I'm sorry, the MCAS page looks like, with the URL address at the top. You can see there are usually headlines, but most of the juice, most of the gravity is at the left side of the page when all these topics present themselves. I've circled the ones in red that have to do with what we're talking about today, but there are whole entire pages devoted to accessibility and accommodations, MCAS alternate assessment, and MCAS grade level and competency portfolio. So this is how you get to those pages. And then hopefully you can bookmark those and keep them handy for later. The MCASAlt page looks like this at the URL address at the top of your screen. We're often asked, how do you get to those resources for ESSA and all of the information having to do with rate and frequency of MCASAlt and participation in the districts? That link in the middle of the page that I've circled in red is how you get to the information and resources for MCASAlt, and Every Student Succeeds. There's some important MCASAlt dates. There are flyers posted to the online registration is linked in the middle of this, in the top middle of this slide. We've sent flyers to every school. We've included it in our newsletter, and it's posted in on our website. This is the dates of all of the MCASAlt educator trainings for this fall and winter. And for the grade level and competency portfolios training in January, we're pretty full up, but there may still be room in October for folks to register for the ones that are coming up. But these are the ones that we check in with you in January. Preparing to submit the portfolios occurs beginning in January, when schools order their submission materials, their binders, etc. There are dates on the screen for when that occurs, but it's right after you get back from the holidays. And the binders and those materials for submission come to you in your school the last week of February. So open those up. There's an envelope in there with important paperwork as well as the binders and the envelopes. Good time to touch base with you at the end of February. And then at the end of March, you'll want to schedule your UPS pickup. We'll give you instructions how to do that in the MCASAlt and the SAS newsletters when the time gets closer. And then you want to make sure your portfolios are ready to be picked up from school by 5 p.m. on Friday, April 1st. That's the due date that stands since 2019. And then in 2021, obviously, we extended it. 2020 was canceled. We're going back to this submission date this year. Finally, then, contacting any one of us at 1 minute to 3, so we're right on schedule. Here are our email addresses. There's a MCAS Service Center phone number, the site for those practice tests and tutorials. There's something called the MCASAlt materials site, which is where you can find these slides. It's the third bullet from the bottom. We'll keep this slide on for a minute or two so you can have a look at it and write it down if you want to get these slides if you haven't received the link to them. And then for general inquiries, to follow up on any questions you've had throughout the afternoon, the MCAS@doe.mass.edu general inquiry mail address is there for you as well. Me and 3 of my staff people are listed at the top, and what we do at the department in the student assessment office. How do you reach us individually if you don't want to contact the MCAS mailbox? You can get to us immediately and ask your particular question. So Again, I'm going to leave this slide up for another minute, but I'm going to thank you all for participating and attending. We're going to end the presentation now. We'll have these slides posted and available right now, and you can get those at the third bullet from the bottom. That's how you can get a hold of all of these, and we hope to hear from you in the future. So thank you so much for all your attention and time this afternoon. Have a great day.